So we're going to start off with the base application, the one we start with on every one of these lessons. And the first thing we're going to do is open up one of my favorite extensions called Remove All Comments. Save that. Second thing is we're going to clean this app up a little bit. So we don't need all this in here. We don't need the title. We don't need the title here. We don't need the title here. We don't need the app bar. We could just set it to default title saying to do app. Gonna remove everything from this middle section, and this counter also doesn't matter. And this function there. We simplified the app a lot. So if we reload it, see, it has nothing except this plus that doesn't do anything. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up some folders that keep our code organized throughout the rest of this mini project. We're going to have a folder called models. This is where we will keep our little to-do model, so the thing that defines what our to-do item is going to include. We of course need a folder called pages. This is which will hold all the pages for our application. And the last folder we're going to have is providers. This is what will hold our state for the application. Like I said, within the models, we're going to have a to-do model. We're going to call it to-do.dart. Providers, we're going to have a to-do provider.dart. So this is going to hold the state of our application. And we actually know what kind of pages we're going to have as well. Since we defined it in that diagram, we're going to have an add page. We're going to have a completed page. And of course, the home page. And to clean things up even more, I'm going to take this, my home page class over here, remove it from here, put it in this home page, import Flutter material, and then if we go to the main, I want to import this. Okay, so they're all set up and ready to go. It looks exactly like it did before. And we're going to start the same way we actually started the diagram, with state. Like I said, apps are very data-centric. We want data to be the core of the application. It's the main part that we actually show and we interact with. So why not start development from there as well? The very first thing related to data is what the actual data will contain. So let's define our data class, and that class is going to be a to-do class. We're going to have two things in it. We're going to have a to-do ID. We're going to have a string of the actual content of our to-do item, and then we're going to have a Boolean called completed. Now I actually want to properly define this class, so we're going to have a required to-do ID. We're going to require all the fields because we can't really have a to-do item without having all three of these. A completed and the actual content. So this is our to-do class. So the data that we're going to be using with our application is these three pieces of data within a class called to-do. Now we also know how we're going to interact with that data. So we can set up our state notifier provider. And to do that, we first need to import the package. So we need to add Flutter RiverPod to our project. And then we can set up our state notifier provider. So I'm going to call it a to-do provider. There's a state notifier provider. And actually, if you have an extension called RiverPod Snippets, Flutter RiverPod Snippets, start typing all that out, you can just do state notifier provider. I want to call this to-do provider, and we're going to have a to-do list notifier, and we're going to provide the actual list of to-do items. need to import that. Okay, so next we haven't defined, we're going to need to import this to-do item, which it's not letting me import it automatically because I think it wants me to fix this to-do list notifier first. So let's do that. And we could use the verb pod snippets again and create a state notifier. We're going to call this the to-do list notifier. And it's going to provide us a list of to-dos. There we go. So now let's just bring that in. All right, we missed another bracket here. There we go. And now to do unimported for some reason, we'll import it back. And there we go. We have our state notifier set up. Some of this didn't make sense. Please go back to the state notifier provider lesson because we explained it there. But just quick recap. So this to-do provider is the one that we're going to be using throughout our application. So this is giving access to our whole to-do list notifier where we're going to be doing all the actions. So we give access to the functions and then the actual state. And then within this state notifier, we're going to have 3 ways we could play around with this data. We're going to have the add to do function. We're going to have a complete to do. And then lastly, we're going to have a delete to do item. So to add a to do, we need the actual content, what kind of to do item we want to be adding. Completing a to do, we want the integer, want the to do ID of which to do item we want to complete, and then delete. We're just going to pass the whole to do item. For the complete to do, we just pass the ID because you need to parse the list either way so you can find it and then update it. For this, it's just easier to just delete the whole to do. And now lastly, we could actually implement these functions and we should have the function of our application, or at least the data manipulation part of it done. So since this is a state notifier, you can only set the state. You can't change it. So when we're adding a to do, we're going to take everything within the previous state and we're going to add a new to do item. So the content is content, completed will be false because by default it's not completed. And then to do ID, we're going to have a little algorithm for that. And the algorithm I'm going to set up is we're going to check if the state is empty. If it is, set the to do ID to 0. If it is not empty, take the state.length, subtract 1 from that, because let's say the state is a length of 2. The index for the array will be 0 and 1, so you want to make sure you subtract 1. And then take that item in that position, so state at this ID, get their to-do ID, and then add 1. So a little bit more complicated way of adding 1 to the very last item within the to-do list, so the to-do ID will always be 1 more. So that's how we will add a to-do item. Now completing a to-do, remember we have to set the state. And for this one, I said we're going to have to loop through all of the to-do items. So what we're going to do. So we're going to set up a loop to loop through every item within the to-do list. So that's the state. That's the old to-do list. We're going to loop through it. And for each one, we're going to check if the to-do ID of that item matches the ID that we're passing in here. If it does, we want to update that item to have the to-do ID, which is the exact same. We don't want to change the to-do ID. The content, to-do.content, we want to keep the same, but the completed, we want to set to true. And then if the to-do ID is not equal to that, we just want that to be the to-do item. So we go through the loop. If it's equal to the ID, we want to update this one field. Otherwise, just keep the list as it is. And then lastly, for deleting the to-do, I actually looked back at my previous code. We actually can just use the ID. We will have to iterate through the whole list. So we take the state where our list of to-dos does not include the ID that we passed in. Now I want to turn that back to a list. So this goes through all the to-dos, returns an iterable for you of all the to-dos without this ID that we passed in, and turns that into a list. So all our functions are defined. Now our app doesn't change, doesn't look any different from the visual aspects, which is totally fine because we built this with state management in mind. Our state is set up and ready to go. Now we just fill out the UI, which is the easy part, and make sure it looks nice. But we know that it will act as we want it to. So next lesson, we'll actually add a to-do item.